Have you ever thought you knew someone, only to discover a shocking truth that shattered everything you believed? Meet Jasmine Williams, a woman whose radiant smile and kind demeanor made her the picture of grace. To the outside world, she was the perfect mother, the perfect partner, the perfect person. But behind closed doors, she became a monster, tormenting her partner in ways unimaginable. In 2020, this story made headlines across the United States for a reason you wouldn't expect. Jasmine, an African-American woman, became the first in the country to be convicted and sentenced for domestic violence and coercive control against a man. This was a case that turned everything we thought we knew about abuse upside down. What started as a seemingly innocent relationship, full of hope and promise, soon spiraled into something dark and terrifying. The real question is, how did it go so wrong? How did a woman, whose face appeared to be an angel, transform into a tormentor, so cruel, so cunning, that even the victim didn't realize the depth of the danger until it was almost too late? Stick with us as we unravel the tragic, horrifying case of Jasmine Williams, a woman whose twisted version of love broke a man beyond repair. Stay tuned, because this is one story you won't forget. Let us start where it all began. Jasmine Williams, born prematurely on a cool autumn morning, her small frame was a testament to fragility. Her mother, Renee Williams, had been through a long, exhausting labor. When the nurse handed her the tiny bundle, still so small that her fingers barely fit inside the palm of Renee's hand, she couldn't help but feel both a deep sense of relief and an overwhelming sense of fear. Jasmine's birth wasn't supposed to be this way. The doctors had warned Renee early on that there were complications. Jasmine's arrival came 5 weeks too soon, her lungs underdeveloped and her body weak. Yet, even in those early hours of life, there was something about Jasmine's quiet resolve that seemed to speak volumes. Her premature status was a sign of her struggle, but also an early marker of the strength that would carry her through life's challenges. From the start, Jasmine was surrounded by love. Her father, Marcus, a truck driver who was often away on long hauls, would come home at night, eyes tired but full of joy, and hold her in his arms like she was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. Despite the demanding nature of his work, he made it a priority to be present whenever possible. But there was something bittersweet about Marcus's love. It was both protective and distant. He was a man of few words, and though he was there, he rarely shared his feelings or expressed his emotions outwardly. This left a quiet void in Jasmine's life, a void that would eventually manifest itself in ways no one could predict. Her mother, Renee, was a woman of strength and resilience. She had come from humble beginnings, and her focus was always on survival. But in her attempts to make ends meet, her presence became more functional than nurturing. She worked long hours in a local diner and took on odd jobs, doing whatever she could to keep the family afloat. In the moments when Jasmine needed her most, Renee was often absent, her mind consumed with the worries of paying bills, keeping food on the table, and holding everything together. And so, as a little girl, Jasmine learned early on that love wasn't always about affection. It was about stability. But stability often meant sacrifice, and the emotional side of Jasmine's life was left to settle into the cracks between her mother's duties and her father's distant affection. Jasmine's early years were shaped by a delicate balance of affection and neglect. Her parents' relationship, though built on years of history, was anything but perfect. Renee and Marcus had both come from broken homes, and their bond was founded on their shared understanding of hardship. But the emotional toll of their individual struggles created a subtle but ever-present distance between them. Renee often felt like she was carrying the weight of the family alone, while Marcus, though supportive in his own way, couldn't seem to bridge the gap between being physically present and emotionally available. There were moments of warmth in the Williams household, dinners shared around the small kitchen table, a brief weekend trip to the beach when Marcus was home for a rare few days, and Sunday afternoons spent watching old movies. But for Jasmine, these moments were fleeting. They were the calm before the storm. But as much as Jasmine tried to make sense of the world around her, she couldn't quite put her finger on what was missing. What she did know, though, was that if she wanted attention, she had to earn it. And as a child who learned early to be charming and well-behaved, she became adept at using her intelligence, beauty, and wit to fill the void. Though outwardly charming and seemingly well-adjusted, Jasmine's life at home was a different story. Her mother's neglect became more pronounced as the years went on. Renee, always tired and burdened by the demands of her work, began to withdraw even more emotionally. When Jasmine needed her most, during the awkward teenage years when girls struggle with identity and body image, her mother was either too tired or too preoccupied to offer the guidance Jasmine desperately needed. Jasmine's father, though kind, was distant. He provided for the family, but his emotional availability was non-existent. He loved her in his own way, but his love was practical, not emotional. His emotional unavailability became a silent source of pain for Jasmine, who struggled to understand why her father didn't love her the way she longed to be loved. This emotional neglect became a defining aspect of her childhood. Jasmine learned early that people were either distant or indifferent, and the ones who loved her were never there when she needed them most. This realization shaped her ability to manipulate those around her in later years. Jasmine's college years were marked by the same patterns she had perfected in high school. She was popular, charismatic, and successful, but still emotionally detached. As Jasmine entered adulthood, the experiences of her childhood, her emotional neglect, her desire for control, and the constant search for validation began to form the foundation of the woman she would eventually become. While she had managed to manipulate and charm her way through many relationships, the cracks in her emotional state were beginning to show. She had learned to hide her true self behind a mask of perfection, but the mask was starting to crack. The emotional pain she had hidden for so long was beginning to surface, and it would eventually lead her down a dangerous path. But at this moment in time, Jasmine Williams was still in control, just like she always had been. She just hadn't yet realized that control over others would never be enough to heal the deep, hidden wounds inside her. But behind closed doors, the picture-perfect image would quickly crumble. The woman who was adored by friends, family, and even strangers was not the person she appeared to be. Jasmine was capable of horrific things that no one would have ever believed, least of all her partner, Marcus. It was the fall of 2012, and Jasmine Williams had just started her second year at a prestigious university in Chicago. On the first day of her second semester, sitting across the room in the class, in the very front row, was Marcus Brooks. Marcus was, quite simply, everything Jasmine wasn't, or at least, everything Jasmine had convinced herself she couldn't be. With dark, silky hair that cascaded in waves down his back and eyes that held the weight of some quiet wisdom, Marcus looked like someone who had walked out of an old painting, a figure of grace, intelligence, and mystery. He wasn't just handsome. He radiated a kind of ethereal glow that drew the eyes and the heart. He was one of those rare individuals who seemed to transcend the usual college dynamics, and Jasmine couldn't help but feel both captivated and envious of him. As the semester progressed, their interactions became inevitable. Despite their contrasting personalities, something about Marcus's quiet intelligence resonated with Jasmine. But that resonance also sparked a deep insecurity. Marcus made Jasmine feel like she wasn't enough, not in a way that would have been obvious, but in a way that gnawed at her subconscious, forcing her to confront the emptiness that her life had become. It was rare to see someone as popular as Marcus unaccompanied, and Jasmine, always one to seize an opportunity to make connections, decided to approach him. "Hey, Marcus, right?" Jasmine asked with a friendly smile as she stepped closer to where Marcus was sitting. Marcus looked up from the book he was reading, his expression initially neutral but quickly softening when he saw Jasmine. "Yeah, that's me. Jasmine, right?" Jasmine nodded, her eyes momentarily drawn to the book Marcus was reading. "Are you reading The Social Animal?" she asked. Marcus smiled, and for a moment, the whole world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them. "Yeah, I am. It's one of my favorites. I know it's kind of cliché for a psychology student, but I find it fascinating how we, as humans, are all so driven by social needs, without even realizing it sometimes." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, intrigued. She hadn't expected Marcus to be so introspective. They continued talking, their conversation flowing easily, as if they had known each other for years. Jasmine was struck by how effortless it felt to talk to Marcus. It was as if he was genuinely listening to Jasmine, seeing her in a way that no one else had. No judgments, no assumptions, just a quiet, interested presence. The two of them sat on that bench for nearly an hour, chatting about everything from childhood memories to their personal aspirations. It felt strangely intimate. For the first time in a long time, Jasmine felt seen. Not for her social status, not for her looks, but for who she was, her thoughts, her ideas, her complexities. Marcus saw past all of the perfect exterior and recognized the insecurities, the fears, and the longings that Jasmine had buried deep within herself. But with this connection came a new set of challenges. Jasmine found herself, once again, battling her insecurities. Marcus didn't need to compete. He didn't need to prove his worth. And Jasmine was starting to question whether her own constant need for validation was the thing that kept her from truly being happy. Jasmine began to admire the way Marcus carried himself, so sure, so grounded, and so unbothered by the judgment of others. Marcus didn't need to constantly seek attention, and that was both an intriguing and frightening concept for Jasmine. As their friendship deepened, Marcus's influence over Jasmine grew. Jasmine began to open up about her past, the emotional neglect she had faced, the void she often felt despite her outward perfection, and her constant need to be the best at everything. But the idea of being vulnerable was terrifying. It was easier to keep up the facade, to play the role everyone expected her to. It was harder to confront the feelings she had buried, the hurt she had hidden under layers of achievement, charm, and perfection. Yet, in Marcus's presence, Jasmine felt like it might be okay to let go, even just a little. Though the bond between Jasmine and Marcus was still young, Jasmine was beginning to realize that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. And that, more than anything, was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The question now was whether Jasmine could let go of her need for control and embrace the vulnerability and authenticity that Marcus had so effortlessly mastered. And more importantly, whether she could learn to love herself, not the version of herself that she showed to the world, but the version that existed in her heart. They started dating shortly after, and in the beginning, everything seemed perfect. Jasmine was everything Marcus had hoped for in a partner. She was sweet, attentive, and caring. They spent their evenings together, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. But it didn't take long for the cracks to begin showing. It started with little things. Jasmine would check Marcus' phone, questioning him if a female friend texted him too late. She'd ask him where he'd been, even if he'd only stepped out for a few minutes. It seemed harmless, even endearing at first, but soon it became suffocating. Marcus brushed it off. He was in love. He convinced himself that it was just her being protective. He never once thought that this behavior could be a sign of something darker beneath the surface. Jasmine's control over Marcus escalated. She began dictating who he could speak to, which friends he could hang out with, and even what clothes he should wear. To an outsider, they still appeared to be a perfect couple, but inside their home, Marcus was living in a nightmare. Jasmine would humiliate him in private, calling him names and belittling him for the smallest mistakes. When Marcus would try to push back, she would use her charm to reel him back in. "I'm just doing this because I love you," she would say. "You need me to guide you." Slowly, Marcus became isolated from his family and friends, and even his job. Jasmine would manipulate him into quitting his career, controlling the finances, and making decisions on his behalf. By the time Marcus realized what was happening, it was too late. As the years went on, the abuse became more severe. Jasmine didn't just control Marcus's every move. She took complete ownership of his life. He couldn't make a decision without her input. She would monitor his every conversation, from text messages to phone calls, and even demanded to know where he was at all times. The isolation became absolute. Marcus tried to leave several times, but each time, Jasmine would guilt-trip him into staying. She'd cry, tell him he was abandoning her, that she needed him. She'd remind him of all the sacrifices she'd made for their family. And each time, Marcus would come back, thinking that it would get better, that the love they shared would return. But it didn't. It only worsened. Little by little, Jasmine's influence spread. Marcus began canceling plans with his friends, making excuses to avoid family gatherings, and spending more and more time alone with Jasmine. He wasn't sure when he had become so isolated, but he knew that when he was with her, he felt like he was the center of her world. And that, at the time, felt like the most comforting thing. Jasmine's control over Marcus became more overt as the weeks passed. She insisted that he quit his part-time job, claiming it was interfering with his studies. "You should focus on your future, Marcus," she said one night, after he had worked a late shift. "You don't need that job. I can take care of us. Don't you want to concentrate on what really matters?" Marcus, who had been working to support himself, was hesitant, but Jasmine reassured him. "You're mine, Marcus. I want you here with me. You don't need anything or anyone else." The words seemed logical at the time, even comforting. The idea of being taken care of having one less thing to worry about, was seductive. Soon enough, Marcus quit his job. Jasmine had told him it would be better for his mental health. "You're always so tired when you come back," she would say, her concern genuine and wrapped in a softness that made him second-guess himself. But the reality soon became clear. The more he gave in to her demands, the more his life seemed to shrink. His world had shrunk down to just Jasmine. His friends, his ambitions, his family, they were no longer a part of his daily life. Jasmine had convinced him that he didn't need them, that he didn't need anyone but her. And in some ways, Jasmine began to become everything to Marcus, his lifeline, his world. By the time winter break rolled around, the shift in their relationship had become undeniable. Marcus had grown accustomed to Jasmine's constant presence, her continuous commentary on his appearance, his actions, his decisions. She started critiquing everything. How he spoke, the way he walked, even the way he smiled. "You should smile more, Marcus. You look so much more attractive when you smile like you mean it," she'd say, her tone drenched with affection, yet hinting at the discomfort of her criticisms. Jasmine also began taking a more active role in controlling Marcus's interactions with his family. "Your mom doesn't get it, Marcus. She just wants you to live for her, but you have your own life now. You should be focusing on your future, not trying to make everyone happy all the time," Jasmine would say. Her words were poison, dressed as care. At first, Marcus pushed back, telling Jasmine he couldn't just ignore his family. But her response was always calm, logical, and firm. "I'm just saying you need to prioritize yourself. They don't understand what we have. They don't understand you like I do. They never will." Soon, Jasmine had managed to isolate Marcus further. He started skipping family gatherings, ignoring his mother's calls, and making excuses to avoid his siblings. Each time, Jasmine was there to offer her support, her soothing words helping him justify his actions. "I know how hard it is to disappoint people you love, but I'll always be here for you, Marcus. You don't need them. Not like you need me." As the months passed, Marcus's sense of self began to wither. His every action, every thought, seemed to be tied to Jasmine's approval. He had once been an independent, driven young man with dreams of a future beyond the walls of his small college town. But now, his world had become a labyrinth of Jasmine's design, where his needs, his desires, were secondary to hers. Jasmine's behavior became more aggressive. She would snap at him for the smallest things, an accidentally misplaced book, a forgotten text message. It wasn't just controlling anymore, it was outright cruel. Her words could cut deeper than any physical blow. I told you to stop dressing like that. It makes you look weak. I can't be with someone who doesn't take care of himself, she would say, her voice dripping with disdain as Marcus stood in front of her, his heart heavy with guilt. And then came the final command. I think it's time you left school. You don't need it, Marcus. You need to focus on us. On our future. The degree won't do anything for you. But I will. You'll be happier with me by your side. Jasmine's control over Marcus continued to tighten, but the cracks in their relationship began to show. Marcus's spirit, once vibrant and full of life, began to fade, replaced by a version of himself that was constantly trying to meet Jasmine's demands. Jasmine's abuse was no longer just emotional. It was psychological and manipulative, wrapped in a veneer of love and care. And Marcus, for all his growing confusion and pain, was so deeply entangled in her web that he couldn't see the exit. It wasn't until much later, after the damage had been done, that Marcus would understand how far he had fallen. How the girl who had once seemed so perfect had slowly and methodically dismantled everything he was. But for now, Jasmine was the only thing he knew, the only thing he thought he needed. And so, the cycle continued. It was a hot summer evening when the first physical incident occurred. The apartment was cramped, the air thick with tension as Marcus and Jasmine sat in the living room, the television buzzing quietly in the background. It had been a long day for Marcus. He had stayed up late finishing assignments that Jasmine had demanded he prioritize over his own well-being. She had insisted that he cancel plans to meet his family, suggesting that it was a waste of time. But Marcus, in an attempt to please her, had agreed. She hadn't said much, but the tension in the air was undeniable. "Marcus," Jasmine called out, her voice cold. "Where's the hammer I left out? I need to fix the shelf in the kitchen." Marcus, still feeling drained from the endless hours spent trying to meet Jasmine's ever-growing demands, was barely listening. He had been zoning out, staring at his phone, wondering when he would get his next chance to escape this suffocating relationship. "I'm not sure," Marcus replied absent-mindedly, his mind still on the conversation he had with his mother earlier. Jasmine's voice cut through the air like a razor. "You never listened to me." She stood up abruptly, her face red with anger. Her eyes, once soft and captivating, were now sharp and terrifying. Before Marcus could even react, Jasmine grabbed the hammer from the nearby shelf and hurled it in his direction. Time seemed to freeze. The hammer flew through the air with an eerie accuracy, striking Marcus on the side of his head. A sharp, searing pain bloomed across his skull as the metal head of the hammer collided with his temple. Blood poured down his face, blurring his vision. He staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching up to his head, feeling the slick warmth of his blood. "Jasmine, what the hell?" Marcus began, his voice shaky, his breath ragged. But Jasmine didn't apologize. There was no remorse in her eyes. She was angry. Her gaze was fixed on him, and the rage in her face was palpable. "You don't get to ignore me, Marcus. You don't get to dismiss me like that." Marcus, dazed and bleeding, felt a mix of confusion and disbelief. He couldn't fathom what had just happened. This was a woman he had once trusted, a woman he thought loved him. Yet now, she stood before him with a look of cold fury, as if the physical act of throwing a hammer at his head was justified. For the next few days, Marcus tried to convince himself it was an isolated incident, an emotional outburst. But the pain in his head and the swelling that had started to form around the wound on his temple were constant reminders of what had happened. Jasmine, on the other hand, acted like nothing was wrong. When he complained about the pain, she scoffed at him. "It's not that bad, Marcus. You're being dramatic. You'll live." She barely even acknowledged the injury. Instead, she continued to manipulate him, playing the victim. "I'm just so stressed out. You have no idea what it's like to have everything on your shoulders," she would say, her voice tinged with the same false vulnerability that had once hooked him. Marcus, confused and emotionally drained, didn't push the matter. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to believe that she didn't mean it, that maybe it was just an accident, a slip-up. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. And from that day on, it wasn't just the emotional abuse that took hold. Physical violence was now part of their relationship. Over the next few months, Jasmine's physical abuse became more frequent. The slaps, the shoves, the moments where she would grab him by the collar and slam him into the wall. Each instance a silent warning that things had gone beyond what Marcus could have ever imagined. It was as though the more he tried to retreat, the more Jasmine pushed forward, her anger growing each time she felt slighted. Her need for control had gone beyond the psychological manipulation. Now, it manifested in raw, physical dominance. During a fight about a missed dinner reservation, Jasmine exploded. "You ruined everything, Marcus," she screamed, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. "I told you to get ready earlier, but you didn't listen. You never listened to me." The pain was unbearable as Jasmine twisted his arm, her grip so tight that it felt as if his bones might snap. She shoved him against the kitchen counter, sending a shock of pain through his body. But the worst part wasn't the physical violence. It was the look of satisfaction on her face. Jasmine's eyes gleamed, almost as if she were enjoying the power she held over him. "You don't get to ignore me," she said, her voice low and menacing. "Not ever again." Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but he couldn't. Something inside him had snapped, and he felt himself become smaller, more compliant with each passing day. As the physical abuse grew worse, so did the emotional and psychological manipulation. Jasmine started controlling Marcus's access to basic needs, food, sleep, and even his personal space. There were nights when she would withhold food from him, leaving him hungry and weak. "If you want to eat, you'll do what I ask of you," she'd taunt. On some occasions, she wouldn't even let him sleep, keeping him up late with incessant demands. "We need to talk, Marcus. We need to fix this. You're not allowed to sleep until you understand what I'm telling you." And if Marcus dared to try to sleep anyway, Jasmine would throw things at him, waking him up with the sound of objects crashing against the walls. "Don't ignore me," she would hiss. "You're not allowed to check out, not until we're done." The exhaustion from the constant emotional torment, combined with the physical abuse, left Marcus in a haze. He had no energy to fight back, no strength to ask for help. Jasmine's words echoed in his mind like a constant refrain. "You don't need anyone else. You're mine. You're not allowed to leave." And so, Marcus remained trapped. The isolation, the hunger, the physical pain, it all merged together into a single experience. His existence now was Jasmine's to control. It wasn't just the bruises, the broken bones, or the constant state of hunger that Marcus endured. It was the fact that with each passing day, his soul felt more and more hollow. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize. His identity was no longer his own. It belonged to Jasmine. One night, after a violent altercation, Marcus found himself staring at the reflection in the bathroom mirror. His face was bruised, his eyes dull with exhaustion. "How did I get here?" he wondered, his thoughts a jumble of confusion and despair. The door behind him creaked open, and Jasmine stepped in, a sly smile curling on her lips. "You look better when you listen to me, Marcus," she said, running her fingers lightly across the bruises on his cheek. "I'm just trying to help you. You know that, don't you?" Marcus said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Jasmine's abuse had evolved into something far darker than it had been before. It wasn't just the physical violence anymore, though that still occurred frequently, but now it was the unrelenting psychological torment that had begun to wear away at Marcus's mind. She isolated him from everyone he had once known, his friends and family. The most insidious part of it all was how she manipulated Marcus into believing he didn't need anyone but her. She'd convinced him, bit by bit, that he was the problem, not her. That any attempt to reach out to his family or friends would be an act of betrayal. "Do you really think they care about you, Marcus?" she would sneer, her voice dripping with contempt. "They just want to take you away from me." Jasmine's psychological manipulation soon extended to depriving Marcus of basic needs, and her tactics became more calculated. She knew exactly what he needed and how to withhold it in order to break his spirit. Food was one of the first things she took control over. She would leave him with nothing to eat for days at a time, forcing him to beg for scraps. When he would ask for food, Jasmine would coldly tell him, "If you want food, you need to earn it. You haven't been behaving properly." The hunger was a constant companion for Marcus. He would spend long hours pacing the apartment, his stomach empty and his mind growing weaker by the hour. He was losing weight, his body becoming frail, but Jasmine seemed to take pleasure in seeing him like this. "Look at you," she would mock him, standing over him while he sat on the floor, staring at the empty cupboards. "You're nothing without me. I'm the only reason you still exist." Jasmine's physical abuse escalated, becoming more brutal and erratic. The hammer incident had been the first, but now she would strike Marcus with whatever was within reach, her fists, a belt, even objects that were meant to be used for mundane tasks. Her anger was a volatile force, unpredictable and violent. One evening, after Marcus had failed to meet her impossible standards of perfection, she snapped. "You always disappoint me, Marcus," Jasmine seethed, standing over him as he knelt on the floor, exhausted. "I don't know why I bother with you. Maybe I should just get rid of you." Before he could say anything, she swung a belt across his back, the crack of the leather against his skin echoing in the small room. Marcus flinched. He could barely breathe, the air thick with the smell of sweat and blood. "Stand up," Jasmine yelled, grabbing him by the hair and pulling him to his feet. "You're not allowed to just sit there and cry. You're pathetic." The belt came down again, this time across his chest. Marcus stumbled backward, his body trembling with shock and pain, but Jasmine wasn't done. She shoved him into the wall, sending him crashing down onto the floor. He could feel the floor beneath him shake, the impact rattling his teeth. As he lay there, broken and unable to move, Jasmine looked down at him with contempt. "Pathetic. You should be grateful for me. If I didn't keep you in line, who would?" Marcus tried to speak, tried to call out for help, but his voice was gone, drowned out by the trauma, by the psychological chains that had been slowly strangling him. He wanted to believe someone would save him, that he would escape this nightmare, but the truth was becoming too hard to face. As the weeks went on, Marcus's mind began to fracture under the strain of Jasmine's abuse. He no longer recognized himself. His once bright eyes had dulled, his smile had vanished, and his laugh, which used to come so freely, was now a rare sound, a hollow echo that seemed foreign to him. The man who once had dreams, goals, and hopes for a future was now a shell of his former self. His thoughts were muddled, the constant torment taking its toll. He couldn't think clearly anymore. Jasmine's words were the only ones that made sense. Her cruel, constant refrain, "You are nothing without me." Her control over him had become so complete that he no longer questioned her actions. When she demanded something, he gave it to her without hesitation. She had erased his boundaries, replacing them with a codependency so deep that it had become ingrained in his very being. "You're not allowed to make decisions, Marcus," Jasmine would say, each word dripping with venom. "You do what I say. That's your job. Do you understand?" "Yes," Marcus would reply, his voice barely a whisper, drained of life. Jasmine had broken him. She had isolated him so completely from the outside world that he could no longer distinguish what was real from what she had forced him to believe. He was a prisoner, not just in her apartment, but in his own mind. The abuse was relentless. Every day felt like a battle just to survive. But as time passed, a part of Marcus began to die. The man who had once been full of potential and dreams now existed only to serve Jasmine's whims. She had turned his world into a nightmare from which there was no waking. Marcus, his body already weak and frail from months of abuse, could only try to shield himself. He could barely stand from the hunger and fatigue, let alone fight back. "Please, Jasmine, stop," he pleaded, his voice a hoarse whisper. But Jasmine's anger had already clouded any sense of rationality she might have once had. She grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back, and with all the force she could muster, slammed his face into the edge of a countertop. Blood poured from his nose, staining his shirt as he collapsed to the floor, disoriented and in shock. That was when the neighbors, who had endured months of the escalating violence next door, finally took action. It had taken too long for someone to intervene. But when the screams rang out through the thin walls of the apartment complex, something inside one of the neighbors broke. They couldn't ignore it anymore. They dialed 911, and the words came out frantically, trembling with a mixture of fear and concern. "There's something going on next door. We keep hearing screams. It sounds like someone's being hurt." The dispatcher, calm but urgent, reassured the caller that help was on the way. "We'll send officers over immediately. Please stay on the line." Minutes later, sirens wailed outside the apartment complex, their shrill noise cutting through the otherwise quiet night. Marcus, lying motionless on the floor, could hear the pounding footsteps outside the door. Jasmine was still standing over him, her hands shaking with anger. She had no intention of letting him escape her clutches. "Get up," she hissed, her voice low but dangerous. "They'll believe me, Marcus. You've been trying to ruin everything. They'll think you did this to yourself." But Marcus was barely conscious, his vision swimming in and out of focus. His face was covered in blood, his body a raw and broken mess of bruises and injuries. He could barely move, let alone defend himself. The door slammed open. 2 police officers rushed in, taking in the scene at a glance. One immediately went to Marcus, kneeling beside him while the other stood facing Jasmine, whose calm demeanor now seemed forced and hollow. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, his voice firm. Jasmine looked at them, her face a picture of feigned concern. I don't know. He's been acting strange lately," she stammered, her eyes wide. "I think he's been hurting himself. I tried to help him, but he just keeps doing this." The officer's eyes narrowed. He turned to his partner, who was examining Marcus closely, his face hardening as he took in the injuries. "This doesn't look like self-harm," the officer said quietly. "You need to step back, ma'am." Jasmine stood frozen, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. Soon after, Marcus was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the nearest hospital. The injuries were so severe that doctors had to work quickly to stabilize him. Broken ribs, contusions, deep lacerations, and signs of prolonged physical and emotional abuse. These were just a few of the things the medical staff discovered. The doctors immediately set to work, carefully treating the wounds that would have otherwise. Back at the apartment, Jasmine was still being questioned by the police. Her calm facade was beginning to crack as the officers continued to probe deeper into her story. "We have a witness who heard screaming and called it in," one of the officers said bluntly. "We also have a victim who has made it clear you were the one who hurt him. Care to explain what happened here?" Jasmine's eyes widened in disbelief. The officers had caught her in a lie. "It wasn't me," she shouted, her voice rising with panic. "He's lying. He did this to himself. I'm just trying to help him. You have to believe me." But it was too late. The officers continued to press her, but she could feel the walls closing in. She could no longer escape the truth. After hours of questioning, the police had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. Jasmine was taken into custody, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back as she was led away, still protesting her innocence. "You don't understand. He's crazy. He's been hurting himself. You have to believe me." Jasmine screamed as she was led into the back of the police car. But no one was listening anymore. The officers knew the truth. They had seen enough to understand that Marcus had been trapped in a nightmare of abuse, and that Jasmine had been the architect of it all. As Marcus slowly began to heal in the hospital, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was no longer in Jasmine's control. He was free, but freedom came at a price. The emotional scars left by Jasmine's manipulation would take years to heal, and the physical injuries were only a small part of the trauma Marcus had endured. Still, he had a chance now. a chance to rebuild his life and to seek justice for the nightmare he had survived. The officers moved quickly. One of them took Jasmine aside to question her further, while the other began speaking to Marcus. His voice was gentle, trying to get through to him. "Hey, Marcus, can you hear me? You're safe now, okay? We're here to help you." Marcus could barely respond, his voice a faint rasp. His eyes fluttered open, his gaze landing on the officer. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a faint, broken whisper. She hit me. She hurt me." The officer nodded and looked at his partner. "We need an ambulance. He's in bad shape." Soon after, Marcus was loaded into an ambulance and rushed to the nearest hospital. The injuries were so severe that doctors had to work quickly to stabilize him. Broken ribs, contusions, deep lacerations, and signs of prolonged physical and emotional abuse. These were just a few of the things the medical staff discovered. His weight had dropped drastically, and his body was covered in old and new bruises, some in places that were hard to even imagine. The doctors were appalled by the extent of the damage and immediately set to work, carefully treating the wounds that would have otherwise claimed Marcus's life. A nurse, after examining him, turned to the doctor with a look of horror. This is a pattern of sustained abuse. It's not just one incident. This poor man has been tortured for a long time." Back at the apartment, Jasmine was still being questioned by the police. Her calm facade was beginning to crack as the officers continued to probe deeper into her story. She had no choice but to keep up the lie, but the cracks were starting to show. "We have a witness who heard screaming and called it in," one of the officers said bluntly. "We also have a victim who has made it clear you were the one who hurt him. Care to explain what happened here?" Jasmine's eyes widened in disbelief. The officers had caught her in a lie, and she could feel her control slipping away. "It wasn't me," she shouted, her voice rising with panic. "He's lying. He did this to himself. I'm just trying to help him. You have to believe me." But it was too late. The evidence of Marcus's injuries spoke for itself, and Jasmine's story no longer held weight. The officers continued to press her, but she could feel the walls closing in. She could no longer escape the truth. After hours of questioning, the police had gathered enough evidence to make an arrest. Jasmine was taken into custody, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back as she was led away, still protesting her innocence. "You don't understand. He's crazy. He's been hurting himself. You have to believe me." Jasmine screamed as she was led into the back of the police car. But no one was listening anymore. The officers knew the truth. They had seen enough to understand that Marcus had been trapped in a nightmare of abuse, and that Jasmine had been the architect of it all. As Marcus slowly began to heal in the hospital, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was no longer in Jasmine's control. He was free. The courtroom fell silent as the judge's gavel came down. 7.5 years in prison, he declared, for grievous bodily harm, coercive control, and domestic abuse. Jasmine stood motionless in the defendant's box, her expression a tangled mess of disbelief, shame, and cold fury. Gone was the charismatic mask she had once worn so effortlessly, the angelic facade that had fooled so many. What stood in front of the court now was the truth, a perpetrator of pain who had used power, beauty, and control to destroy a man's life from the inside out. The sound of the sentence echoed like a cannon in Marcus's chest. He sat in the gallery, his face still marked with the faint traces of the injuries that had nearly taken his life. His hands trembled in his lap, not from fear, but from the overwhelming wave of vindication. After years of torment, after gaslighting, humiliation, isolation, and violence, someone finally believed him. Justice wasn't just served. It was heard. It was felt. The court's decision didn't just put Jasmine behind bars. It reshaped Marcus's future. Their 2 children, previously caught in the gravitational pull of Jasmine's toxic orbit, were placed in the care of Marcus and his loving parents. The very people Jasmine had once driven away were now the pillars of a new beginning. Marcus remembered the day he picked them up. They were scared, confused. They hadn't seen him in months, and their little faces didn't fully understand why mommy was gone or why daddy looked so different. But kids know love when they feel it, and they felt it immediately. He hugged them like lifelines, like two pieces of his soul that had finally returned home. It wouldn't be easy. The children, like him, bore invisible wounds. They had seen too much, heard too much. But for the first time in years, they were safe. They had warmth, bedtime stories, and food on the table that didn't come with conditions. They had a father who tucked them in with promises he could finally keep. Jasmine served 5 years of her 7.5-year sentence. Despite her past manipulations, the system held firm. She spent much of her sentence in solitary for behavioral issues early on. But over time, even she seemed to shift. Isolation didn't provide control, it forced reflection. Whether sincere or not, she began participating in therapy, eventually speaking to prison psychologists about her own traumatic past, her need for dominance, and the darkness she tried to bury under her charm. Some called it redemption. Others weren't sure. By the time she was up for parole, Jasmine appeared changed. Still controlled in demeanor, but no longer the same firebrand who had gaslit, battered, and imprisoned Marcus in his own home. The parole board agreed to release her, but with strict conditions. She was forbidden from contacting Marcus or the children. No letters, no indirect messages, no appearances. Her face, once plastered across tabloids, now faded into the background. And that's how Marcus wanted it. Years later, Marcus stood on the steps of the courthouse where his life had changed. He wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't hiding behind excuses or shame. He had a job he loved, kids who adored him, and a community that had rallied behind his courage. Justice, he realized, didn't just mean punishment. It meant being heard, being believed, being free. He looked up at the sky, calm, open, endless, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the court, not to Jasmine, but to the version of himself that never stopped fighting, even when no one saw him, especially when no one did. If you've come this far, you've walked with Marcus through his nightmare and back. You've seen how love can be used as a weapon, and how truth can be a shield. Abuse doesn't always come with a raised fist. Sometimes it wears a smile. But no matter who you are, man or woman, young or old, your pain is valid. Your voice matters. And there is always a way out. Justice isn't just a sentence. It's survival. It's recovery. It's living to tell your story. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please don't stay silent. Reach out. Speak up. You are not alone. If you absolutely loved this true crime story, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notification because the next story will shock your spine. Stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video.